Welcome to the AME Food Testing Show. Today's topic, food fraud, economically motivated adulteration. Our guest, Mitchell K. Weinberg. Mitchell is the founder, president, and chief executive officer of the International Supply Chain Assessment Technologies Corporation. He has created a comprehensive solution to protect the world's food supply chains from food fraud, economically motivated adulteration. Using proprietary methodology and specially trained fraud detection professionals, his firm conducts food supply chain vulnerability assessments to identify the sources of food fraud and to recommend mitigation solutions that help to prevent our food from being adulterated. His firm has also created a secure software tool that is used by the food industry to manage and protect food supply chains from food fraud. Taken together, this unique methodology and software comprise its food fraud detection and prevention solution, the first and only solution of its kind in the world. His company helps producers and suppliers, as well as key players throughout the supply chain, to ensure that our food products are secure from food fraud. He's a graduate of Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada, where he obtained a Bachelor's of Arts in Pre-Law and Sociology, and the McGill School of Law in Montreal, Canada, where he obtained his Common Law, LL.B, and Civil Law, BCL degrees in 1991. Prior to founding his firm, he served as Vice President and General Counsel of Future Electronics, the world's third largest semiconductor distributor, where he was responsible for overseeing the company's legal, trade, and human resources and corporate security functions. Now welcome with me, Mitchell K. Weinberg. Mitchell?
Good morning, Andy. Thank you for that introduction. I appreciate it.
Well, you are a most esteemed guest today, talking about a topic which actually frightens me, having been involved in food for many years and a consumer of food for more years than that. I am concerned with the major issue of what is food fraud. Maybe you can explain that for our audience of 67,000 food production, food quality, food safety, and food security managers.
Well, Andy, it's a very good question, and it frankly scares me. And the deeper I dig, the more scared I get. So, food fraud is a relatively new term, and it has to be considered in light of more commonly known terms like food safety, food defense, and food security. It's related to all three, but it's also separate. What food fraud is, the official definition is as follows. It's a collective term used to encompass the deliberate and intentional substitution, addition, tampering, or misrepresentation of food ingredients, or food packaging, or false or misleading statements made about a product for economic gain. And the real distinctive factor about food fraud as compared to, let's say, food defense or food safety is that it is done for economic gain. So, like food defense, which is intentional adulteration for political reasons or behavioral reasons, it is intentional. The distinctive factor, though, is that it's done for profit. The motivating factor is money, which means that it is a much more likely event than perhaps politically motivated food adulteration.
Excellent discussion and definition. Let me ask you, and this is a chilling question, who would commit a food fraud act?
Well, that's an excellent question, Andy. I think that is the most important question that one has to answer. It could literally be anybody along the food supply chain. So one has to go back to source and see who would be most motivated to adulterate food for profit. When we think about the fact that many of our food ingredients around the world come from what could best be described as developing countries, with relatively low standards with respect to food safety and production, where there is a great desire to make profit, there would be a motivation to commit food fraud. So looking at the supply chain, it could be the farmer, it could be the original producer, it could be somebody who handles the transportation, it could be somebody who handles the storage, it could be somebody who handles packaging. It could literally be anybody who handles the food between its source and its ultimate destination.
That's a chilling description of anybody. Let me ask you, what are some of the things that these food fraud actors do to conceal their fraud?
Well, there are actually 7 different types of food fraud, starting with concealment, and we can discuss these kind of progressively to give you examples as to what they are. Concealment is where you're really trying to hide damage or inferiority. So an example would be adding coloring or toxic dyes to fresh fruit to cover defects. Probably the best known example was where melamine was added to milk in China to actually conceal depleted protein content. And in that particular case, what was added to cover the defect or the inferiority was actually highly toxic and resulted in numerous fatalities with children and adults. So it was a very, very serious food fraud event.
So concealment is one of the many types of food fraud acts. What is counterfeiting?
Well, counterfeiting is probably one of the most common types of food fraud. And I won't single out a particular country here, but at least that's not my intention, but China has been particularly creative in counterfeiting food. So counterfeiting is a knockoff. It looks like it's a particular product. Let's say hypothetically, not because I'm aware of a problem, but let's say hypothetically we're dealing with a can of Coca-Cola. It is conceivable that a producer could produce an exact replica of the can of Coca-Cola, and what goes into the can could be something that might look like Coca-Cola. It may even taste like Coca-Cola, but often they don't even care because the goal here is basically to sell the product. They don't really care once the product's been sold. What's in the can could be completely different. And the problem is much more widespread than we realize. And it has happened numerous times in the United States. I'm aware of several situations where counterfeit product has been widely proliferated in the United States, brands that we're all familiar with. In China, they've even gone so far. I mean, it's really outrageous. Probably the craziest counterfeit case is where they actually went so far as to manufacture an artificial egg. So they actually faked a chicken egg, and it was actually cheaper to produce a plastic egg with a synthetic yolk and egg white than it was to actually harvest an egg from a hen. I mean, just outrageous. But we've seen cases of fake peas, which were made out of plastic and dyed green with food coloring. We've seen fake rice, which was a mixture of plastic and potato starch that actually melted when you cooked it. The list goes on and on and on. It's absolutely shocking.
So, Mitchell, what you're saying is that there was a food producer that falsified the content with the intent of making money, irrespective of the harm that they may cause someone of consuming these plastic or other materials.
That's exactly right, Andy. I'll say this in their defense. Their goal is not to cause harm, but at the same time, they're not taking any steps whatsoever to ensure that what they're doing doesn't cause harm. So their sole motivation is to make money.
Well, in that vein, we have listed the fraud act of dilution. What is that?
Dilution is where you take a relatively expensive product. I think probably the best known cases of dilution are actually with olive oil and milk. Any liquid can be diluted with something as simple as water or with other toxic substances so that they can sell more of it. Milk and olive oil are probably the most commonly diluted products that we consume.
Well, as I think about milk, I remember going to the counter and buying whole milk, seeing, 2%, and then seeing a skim. Those are intentionally labored dilutions, aren't they?
That is correct, yes. Those
but we're saying...
products, however, yes, exactly. But what we're saying is... Yeah, go ahead.
What we're saying is that a dilution is that the consumer is actually defrauded because they're paying for something and actually buying something less. Is that what they're saying?
That's exactly right. The weight may be the same, but the contents are different. The contents are actually diluted.
Fascinating. What is the gray or parallel market?
This is an interesting area, and it's hard to actually envision. But where there are rogue producers, where there are contract manufacturers, typically in other countries, if they are contracted to produce X amount of product, they are actually producing more and then selling the extra or surplus production into the gray market. So conceivably, the product is the same when it leaves the production facility, but because it's not through regulated supply chains, what happens is the product can be substituted, counterfeited, diluted, all kinds of things can happen to it because it's not going through the legitimate supply chain for distribution.
Quite often I've seen people selling fruit and vegetables on the side of the road, and they clearly didn't grow them themselves. You're saying this may be part of that gray market. It's actually a viable product, but not through the standard supply chain. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's gotten so bad in certain countries that when consumers in these countries who are aware of food fraud are purchasing fruit and vegetables, they are not producing the fruit and vegetables that necessarily look the best or with the least amount of scarring or bruising. They're intentionally purchasing the more damaged fruit with the hope that it's legitimate, because there's such a suspicion that a perfect-looking piece of produce could well be adulterated in some way, shape, or form to enhance its appearance. It's gotten that bad.
That's a tragic circumstance. Is there theft and diversion involved in this gray or parallel market?
There is. There are several things that go on using illegitimate food supply channels. One of the examples could be, and we've heard of situations of food supply chains for produce and product coming out of Mexico, for example. We know that the drug cartels are using some of these, and this is not necessarily a direct answer to your question, but another example of food fraud. They're using the food supply chains as a way to smuggle drugs into the United States. And that's just one example as to how food supply chains are outside the control of people, legitimate players in the food industry.
Well, that claim of using food as a masking for a different enterprise is very disturbing to me, because it takes away from the sanctity of the purpose of that product, and it may become adulterated from other harsher chemicals, and that's disturbing. What is food mislabeling as an avenue for food fraud?
That's a very common practice The best example I think we can use is with respect to honey. And you notice we're talking about some really commonly used and consumed food products. We've talked about olive oil, we've talked about milk, now we're talking about honey. Vietnam is one of the world's largest producers of highly qualitative honey. What China is doing is it's manufacturing fake honey, removing the pollen from the honey, which is kind of like the DNA fingerprint for honey, labeling it as honey coming from Vietnam and transshipping it through Singapore, because Singapore has a free trade agreement with the United States. So what they're doing here, and this is a little bit of diversion at the same time, is they're avoiding heavy duties as well as disseminating really counterfeit product and representing it as another product. So that's really what mislabeling is. Another example, a very simple one, would be representing fish as being wild, so Alaskan wild salmon, when in fact it's farm salmon coming from Thailand, of all places. And I can tell you that as a consumer, I'm very concerned about farm fish versus wild fish. The conditions upon which some of the fish products and seafood products are farmed are very disconcerting, to say the least, especially in developing countries where we're bringing them in from.
Well, Mitchell, you've been involved as a professional in this area for many years. Can you review for our audience the whole issue of substitution? And I think all of these sound the same now to me after we've been talking about all these categories. What is substitution?
Well, substitution, and they're all different forms of the same kind of thing, Andy, and that's really it. Substitution is a misrepresentation of sort. It's a mislabeling. It's a concealment. It's a counterfeiting. All of them include aspects of the other. Substitution is where you're taking a cheaper or inferior product and substituting it in place of the more expensive product. So the most common example is olive oil, where they're putting cheaper oils like canola oil. We've even heard cases of where they've put motor oil into olive oil or colorant to make it look like olive oil, and they've concealed the taste, but in fact what's put inside is actually inferior. The best known example, I would say, is actually the recent example of horse meat in Europe being sold as beef. That raised the Europeans' eyebrows about food fraud, and now there's been a massive scramble since the beginning of the year to try and introduce legislation and prevent it from happening. But this created tremendous outrage throughout Europe. But that's an example of substitution as well.
Well, Mitchell, I have been very impressed with your dedication and obviously you're volunteering today on the show to enlighten our listenership. Can you let us know about what your firm does to help fight these food fraud acts?
Sure. We're actually the first of our kind in this area. We are best described as an intelligence gathering firm, as well as a crime prevention firm. So, to summarize, we are a food fraud detection and prevention firm. Our approach is very different from the approach taken typically in the area of food safety, because food safety is science-based. It's industrial hygiene. There are very clear standards out there, and it is very easy to ensure that those standards are met, and it's very easy to figure out that if those standards are not met, there could be a problem. With food fraud detection and prevention, the approach is the approach that's taken by an intelligence officer. We literally go into the field and we follow the food and ingredients from its origins all the way up the supply chain. We do so in, and this kind of sounds like a spy movie, we do so very discreetly. We use techniques that are used by intelligence officers. We go undercover and we literally follow the food to try and figure out what's happening to it and where it's happening and who's doing it. So we are working with the major retailers, the major food producers, as well as the major food service companies to help identify where food fraud is taking place. The industry has, for the most part, taken this very seriously, and that's perhaps a separate conversation that we can have, Andy. But I would say that the food industry has reacted very positively to this situation and are taking steps to address it.
Well, Mitchell, yes, I invite you to come back. Let's talk about specific situations which your firm has helped legitimate food producers. And I think the whole goal here is to, not only for consumers, and our audience is primarily food producers and professionals that are concerned about providing safe, quality food for the market. What we're concerned about is eliminating all food fraud. I think if you took a survey of our listenership, they would all say, yes, we don't approve of it. Can you let us know what your firm specifically does, and would you be willing to take on new clients?
Well, absolutely, Andy. I mean, our goal is the same as the goal of your listenership, and frankly, all the legitimate players in the food industry. For your listenership, for the producers, this is about, of course, first and foremost, supplying safe products to your consumers. It's equally about brand protection. As you know, food fraud, and I think a good example that happened in this country was with Peanut Corporation of America a few years ago. That was an example of concealment. They were aware that there was salmonella in the peanut products, and yet they still got disseminated into the marketplace. So in essence, that was a death blow to that company. It was extremely harmful to those who sold peanuts and peanut products for many, many months. Trust was breached. So for the producers and the listenership, this is a very serious issue, and frankly, where there are processed foods, there is a very high risk that one of the ingredients going into that processed food, it could be seasoning, it could be one of the core ingredients that come from outside of the United States. There's a very good possibility that those ingredients could have been adulterated in some way, shape, or form. So they are definitely at risk. As to whether they cause harm, that really depends on what the nature of the food fraud was, but this is a very serious issue given the complexity of global food supply chain.
Well, you answered the first half of the question. How can you help clients, and are you accepting new ones?
Well, I didn't want to be over-solicitous. We are absolutely accepting new clients, and we can help them by working with them to better understand their supply chains, to map out their supply chains, because in a lot of cases, especially with producers, they can typically go back perhaps one or two tiers in the supply chain, but there could be 10 or 15 nodes in the supply chain, meaning where the food changes hands. So, yes, what we do very simply is we first analyze those food supply chains to determine where the highest likelihood of food fraud is, and then we actually dispatch a team to the field, to whatever country it is, and we follow that food or those ingredients from their origins all the way up the supply chain. We document that. We do investigations. We provide the producers with as much information as possible to give them much greater visibility to and control over their supply chains.
Well, Mitch, I'd like to thank you again for your participation today, talking about food fraud and how it's economically motivated. And this is separate from terrorism. This is separate from negligence. This is separate from all of that. These are people that are trying to make money from giving less than they should have done in their efforts to provide safe food. I'd like to now allow you to offer your concluding remarks to our audience, particularly emphasizing the importance of rooting out food fraud in all aspects.
Well, first of all, Andy, thank you very much for this wonderful opportunity. To think that there are 57,000 food professionals that listen to your broadcast is really overwhelming and daunting. But it is a critical issue that perhaps exceeds, in terms of importance, even the implementation of very basic food safety protocols. I think that food safety is sufficiently well advanced now that we don't have to give too much more thought in terms of how to enhance food safety from an unintentional contamination perspective. However, when you think about it, everybody out there is motivated by money, and our global food supply is, as I said earlier, so highly integrated that there's a very good possibility that producers in this country and around the world are not aware that they're incorporating adulterated product into their end product. What that means from a public health perspective, from a reputational perspective, from an economic perspective, the damages that could result from one of these incidents is very significant. And this is crime. And what we're about and what we would like to do with the food industry and the producers is crime prevention. We want to protect your products. We want to protect the consumers. We want to stop this from happening, and that's ultimately what our goal is here.
Well, Mitchell, I'd like to thank you from the bottom of my heart, because I eat food, and this is one of the main reasons why I started this program, was to ensure an upgrade of education for our listenership. And today's show educated me that there is a lot going on out there that I was not aware of in these whole areas of concealment, counterfeiting, dilution, this gray market, mislabeling, substitution, all of it involved with fraudulent food. What a fascinating topic. And as I said before, I invite you, when you have meaningful topics to share with our group, to come back on the show.
Well, it would be my great pleasure, Andy. And once again, thank you very much for this wonderful opportunity. And I welcome people to reach out to me and contact me if they have any questions whatsoever regarding this.
Excellent. I've placed your contact information in the webpage. I encourage people to talk to you and to communicate with you. And we all join in eliminating food fraud in all its forms. Thank you again, Mitchell. Have a great day.
Thank you. You too, Andy. Take care.
Bye. Bye now.
Bye-bye.